Hello, I'm Carola Beresford-Cooke, and I'm here to talk to Tamsin Grainger about her wonderful new book, just about to appear with Singing Dragon, called Working with Death and Loss in Shiatsu Practice. So Tamsin, hello.
Hi,
Congratulations.
Carola. Thank you.
And can we just begin by finding out about you and about how you got into Shiatsu and what your Shiatsu career has been?
Thank you. I started training in Glasgow at the Glasgow School of Shiatsu over 30 years ago. But before that, for a good few years, I had been receiving Shiatsu when I was living in England. And that's part of my journey of Shiatsu, as they say. I was working as a dancer, feeling a bit low. 3 different people said, "Have you tried Shiatsu?" So I eventually heard it. And I had a lovely experience, and it felt to me when I was lying on the mat as if I was being danced by the practitioner. And so I got hooked really quickly. And then I started a school in 2000 with a couple of colleagues, which I ran as a sole director for many years. And I have worked closely with the Shiatsu Society, being the chair for a while. So Shiatsu is my life, and it has been for a long time. I've been doing a lot of walking in the last few years, and when I started walking, I had the idea of writing an article about death and loss, teaching death and loss in my school, and which I did for the Shiatsu Society Journal for my teaching CPD. Now I'm teaching internationally.
So what, when you were walking, actually inspired you to think about this subject, death and loss, and how Shiatsu practice could help with it?
My first important realization, which was entirely to do with my walking, was I know nothing. That as a human being, I don't know anything about the future. I don't know anything about other people. I don't know about the way the world is. I only know now. And that moved on very quickly to a sense of, therefore, I could die any time. And was I where I wanted to be if that was going to happen? And that started off a whole chain of thought and sense and embodied feeling about living, which is also about dying. And I realized that when we touch in Shiatsu, or when I do Zen Shiatsu, and I try to bring my whole self to my touch, to that place where I'm touching, to my hands, to the receiver's body, that is that moment. And that's something very precious wherever you are in life, even if you're right at the end of life and you're trying to make sense of what's going to happen next.
Who is this book for?
Originally, it was for my students. It was for people who were learning to be Shiatsu practitioners. When my father died, which was over 20 years ago now, I had an influx of other clients who were either grieving or facing death in some way. And I realized that it's part of, and always has been part of, my practice. If I work with Shiatsu, I'm working with life and death. And I noticed when I was with people that hearing what they were saying made me aware of what I believed, whether it was a religious belief, whether it was a spiritual belief, whether it was a belief about the way I live my life. And the way I felt about those things was very much part of what was communicated when I touched. And I wanted to make sure that my students had the opportunity, when they were learning, to examine some of those things. What did they believe about death? How has it impacted on them? And when I had the chance to write the book, I realized that there are plenty of practitioners who are maybe even quite experienced, who haven't stopped to think about the impact of touch on people who are grieving or facing loss or dying. And that it would be so interesting to find out more about that. So the book's for practitioners, for students, for teachers of shiatsu. And I think quite a lot of it is probably relevant to psychotherapists and counsellors as well, because I'm not sure it's a topic that's specifically focused on in their training either, but it is something which they come across in their work with clients all the time.
And do you think that also perhaps more orthodox qualified practitioners of orthodox medicine may also be interested in it?
Well, now that I'm working at a hospice and have been for quite a few years, in my conversations with the occupational therapists, the physiotherapists, the other body workers on my team, and the doctors and nurses, I've found that there's been an enormous interest in it. They say to me that even though they are working in the part of the health service which particularly addresses people who are facing death, even if it doesn't happen immediately, that they don't have the opportunity very often to stop and talk about it or think about it or meditate on it. So I think that some of the book will speak to them. Yes, I hope so.
What are the kinds of situations that you're examining in the book? How are you addressing the actual practicalities of death and loss as people may encounter them?
Well, palliative care is in the title, in the subtitle, a guide to bodywork in palliative care. And I think when I first began, that was my focus, is that immediate period before death. But then I realized that that death occurs every day, if you think of it in small deaths of just as change, as things moving, things changing, and that grief and loss and bereavement are subtly different from each other. So I talk about all of those things, and inevitably it brings up pain and trauma and shock as well, and addressing it from the point of view of the client, of the person who might be dying. But also I've worked with so many people, I'm sure you have, who are watching their loved ones change because of some form of life-threatening disease. So I'm really interested in them, supporting how we as practitioners support people who are supporting people who are dying, people who are sitting at the bedside with somebody, people who are facing their own fears about death, because a lot of people walk around being very conscious that something could happen to them at any time, especially at the moment in the pandemic with statistics every day you turn on the radio, you hear how many people died the day before, and with the rules changing all the time, it means that people are scared, people are worried, but that happens with notification of terrorism, with statistics about cancer, with all of these things. There are people who feel that death is surrounding them, and they're having to try to live with that awareness. And I think that shiatsu, this ability, as I said, to bring ourselves into the moment, is so precious as a way of supporting people in that.
So in your book, you recount some of the situations that you've helped people deal with in your own practice. So is there a situation like that you could tell us about now?
Well, it's interesting how the two areas that I have specialized in have have overlapped. I did a lot of work with pregnant women and babies and children because my shiatsu career has overlapped with being a mother. And so lots of the examples when I look at the book now, and I look back at what I've written, are about babies and children and pregnant women and mothers. So yes, I recall a woman who had 3 children, who has 3 children, but her husband died and left her. So she was managing not just her own bereavement and loss of her friend and lover and husband, but the father of her children, and trying to manage their grief and their responses. And it's very subtle. Children of different ages respond very differently to grief. They have very different needs. So this woman was just dealing with the most enormous amount, and obviously my heart really went out to her. And I think she appreciated having time on a one-to-one level with me, where she could manage whatever arose, either at each session or even in different parts of the session. So sometimes she would come with her own sense of loss, of not having somebody there to support her, and other times it would be about the children and how they were managing their lives without their father. So yeah, that's one of the examples that comes to mind.
So, well, this subject, death and loss, it's profound. It touches all of us, and as you point out, it touches us many times in our lives. And is there anything that you found in the philosophy of East Asian medicine that addresses this kind of trauma that we deal with, that you found useful, that you've put forward in the book?
Yes, I think the most overriding fear that people have is what's going to happen to them when they die. I think that not knowing that's the thing I hear more than anything else, to do with death. And for me, the sense, or the East Asian belief that there is this constant, continual flow of qi, and that we exist in it all the time, and we exit that sort of great flow of qi in order to live a life, to incarnate. And when that incarnation is finished, we flow back into that big flow of qi. And for me, although I wouldn't preach that, although I wouldn't tell my clients this is what will happen, because I don't think that's useful if people are not, that's not their belief. I do think that having that, believing that myself, that feels right in myself. And it means that when I work with people, when I'm sitting with them, when I'm touching them, I have a sense of connecting with that deep, long tradition of East Asian theory, of the way things are, of the way that made sense to the people that went before us.
And you embody it in your touch, yes. Well, as you've mentioned in other writings of yours, the shiatsu practitioner has a very long training and a very profound training in this philosophy, and there are different aspects that the shiatsu student will learn, such as the law of the 5 elements, or the interaction of yin and yang, and of course the Chinese and Japanese view of survival after death. And how would you say that the book gives practical instruction to people who may perhaps not have thoroughly integrated the theory? Do you think there's some help there for the shiatsu student in dealing with death and loss?
I hope so. There is an extensive chapter on the theory, and it moves through all those different approaches, Carola. Yes, I think 5 Elements is the one that I'm most familiar with, so maybe that's the longest part of that section. And I give a lot of examples of using the elements in different situations that we might find our clients in. So so there's a lot of theory in that chapter, and I refer to that terminology and to those ideas throughout the rest of the book. There's also exercises, there are meditations, there are lesson plans, there are reflective exercises for students. So there's a lot of very practical information there. But I also think it's quite important for me to say now that I don't believe that I can tell somebody how they touch precisely to support somebody who's grieving, because it's such a broad area, and as with all our clients, everybody responds differently. So I'm also really trying in the book to suggest ways that practitioners can inform themselves, can connect with their real knowing and their own beliefs, and that out of that they will find the right thing to do with that client at that moment. So I hope that there's a balance in the book between lots of practical ideas and ways to get people started, and especially to support themselves as practitioners, to look at boundaries, to look at self-protection, which is a big issue in this work. But at the same time, to free yourself up and to know that the way you flow when you're with a client is the best way, is that's when the inspiration comes, and it's predicated on what you know, but it's different, like all our shiatsu, it's different in every situation.
Great. And for those readers who may not be shiatsu practitioners, who perhaps are more orthodox practitioners, or even family or friends of people who are dying, what kind of practical advice can you give them about the physical situations in which they may be encountering death and loss?
Well, I look into actually what happens to the body when the body's dying. I look at the different emotions that people will experience during the bereavement period. I've got a long section on suicide and on mental health. All of these things are applicable across the board, whatever sort of practitioner you are, and whether or not you're a family member. I think that there's a woman called Kathryn Mannix who wrote a very, very good book. She's a doctor, about how to know what will happen to your loved one if they're dying. And I know that people have found that really, really useful. And I quote from her book, forewarned is forearmed. That's what some people say. So there's a lot of very practical information that's really down to earth about what will happen when you go into hospital, what palliative care is, what's the difference between palliative care and end-of-life care, the different states of a body as it passes over. There's a lot of very practical information, and at the same time I talk about love and about simplicity of touch and the power of just wanting to be with somebody and accompanying them, being with them, being incredibly powerful. You don't have to know an enormous amount of theory. You don't have to know a lot of points, acupressure points. Being human and loving is so important, is the important thing.
And just finally, in the process of writing this book, is there some new aspect of understanding that has come to you What has the book given back to you in your understanding of working with death and loss in shiatsu practice?
As a shiatsu practitioner, I have realized that we are one of the groups of people who are absolutely best prepared to work with people who are suffering in these ways or who are facing these situations, because our training is so whole, because it's physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual, what we do. We can really be with people however they are. Some people who are dying or grieving are really concerned with their physical body. They have pain or they have difficulties which are brought on either by the dying process or by the grieving process. And we can address that, but we can also skip up to an emotional level. We can listen and hear and appreciate and accept people on the spiritual level. So as a practitioner, writing the book gave me a huge amount of confidence in this work. I really think that we are the best placed people to do this type of work. A lot of other practitioners don't have the opportunity to address these other levels. On a personal level, it's just, I love this work. People are stripped bare when they are facing these situations, and so the encounters we have are honest and really, they're real encounters. I know that that's always the case with our work when you're working with people, but
not always.
But when you're facing these terribly deep feelings and questions and beliefs and concerns, if I can be as prepared and as centered as I like to be, then I love that immediacy of the situations.
That's really good. So Tamsin, well, all luck and success to your book. It's a book that really needed to be written, and it needs to be read, and coming out tomorrow, and may it do very well. Thanks
Thank you, Carola. Thank you.